The forest was silent, too silent for October. Even the wind seemed afraid to move through the trees, as if it knew what waited beyond the ridge. Locals called it Hollow's Vale, a stretch of dark Appalachian wilderness that no one entered after sunset. They said the air there was heavy with memory, that it carried the breath of those who never left. But when a lost traveler followed a flicker of lantern light one night, he didn't find a ghost. He found a wedding. It began on an unusually cold autumn night when a traveler named Samuel wandered deep into the Appalachian wilderness, his flashlight barely cutting through the thick mist that hung like breath over the forest floor. The woods were unnaturally quiet, except for the occasional crack of a branch beneath his boots. He had lost his way hours ago, his GPS long useless, swallowed by the dead zone that the locals warned him about. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and the cold bit at his fingers as he stumbled upon a faint glimmer through the trees, a soft, flickering light that seemed to beckon him forward. Thinking it might be a campsite or a remote cabin, Samuel pushed through the undergrowth, ignoring the strange feeling creeping up his spine, the kind that told him he wasn't just being watched but followed. As he neared the source of the light, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted, their bark marked with symbols that looked carved by something not entirely human. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like rust or old blood. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw movement between the trees, a pale figure darting just beyond his vision. Then, through the fog, the cabin appeared. It stood crookedly in a small clearing, its wooden boards swollen with age, its windows covered with warped planks. But inside, through a small crack between the boards, Samuel saw what looked like candlelight dancing across the walls. The door creaked open without him touching it, as if welcoming him in. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, filled with the scent of mold and something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. The room was cluttered with relics of a life once lived, a child's shoe, a broken rocking chair, a porcelain doll missing an eye. Dust covered everything except a small wooden table in the center, where a melted candle burned low beside a single photograph. Samuel leaned closer and froze. The photo showed a man and a little girl, dressed in wedding clothes, standing before the very cabin he was in. The girl couldn't have been older than 8, her expression blank, her eyes empty. The man beside her wore a grim smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then came the sound, faint, like laughter, drifting from somewhere deeper inside the cabin. But it wasn't the laughter of joy. It was high-pitched, distant, and filled with something broken, something ancient. Samuel turned toward the sound, but by then, the candle had gone out, and the woods swallowed his scream. The small mountain town that bordered the edge of Hollow's Vale had a silence that felt deliberate, as if the people there had learned to live without making noise. Samuel's disappearance spread through the area in whispers, but no one seemed surprised. The locals knew what outsiders did not, that the woods beyond the ridge were cursed, a place untouched not by chance but by choice. Old men sitting outside the gas station would lower their voices when the topic arose, glancing toward the forest as though even the trees could hear. They said that past the ridge, the land belonged to a family that wasn't quite right, a bloodline that had sealed itself off from the world generations ago. The last person to trespass there never came back the same, muttering about a girl in white and a man with eyes like wet glass before he disappeared for good. The town had grown around secrets like these, passed down through stories told by candlelight. Children were warned never to play near the ridge, never to follow the sound of laughter from the woods, and never to pick up any trinket they found there, for the forest gave nothing freely. Even the sheriff, a man hardened by years of duty, refused to send deputies that way. He called it dead land, and those who dared to question him received only one reply: some places don't want to be found. Every few years, an outsider would come through, hikers, campers, wanderers, and the pattern would repeat. First, the missing posters. Then, the search parties. Then, nothing but silence and a new layer of fear added to the town's quiet routines. At the heart of the legend was the belief that the family in those woods was still alive. No one had seen them for decades, but hunters claimed to have spotted figures moving at dusk, hunched and pale, watching from between the trees. A few swore they saw lights, not lanterns, but firelight, flickering in patterns like signals. One farmer found animal bones arranged in circles on his property, the remains charred black, and he left town the next morning without a word. To the locals, these weren't coincidences but reminders that the family beyond the ridge still ruled the woods in their own way. The town had learned that survival meant silence, and that curiosity was a sin that the forest punished swiftly. No one dared cross that invisible border, for everyone knew what waited beyond it, not ghosts, but something far worse, a family that never forgot the trespassers who disturbed their solitude. The truth about the girl's marriage came to light years after the first rumors began to spread, buried deep within the crumbling records of the county courthouse. Among yellowed birth certificates and faded property deeds, a clerk discovered a document so disturbing that even reading it felt wrong. It was a marriage certificate dated 1897, naming the groom as Jeremiah Hollow, a man in his mid-30s, and the bride as Mary Ellen, aged 8. There was no mention of her family, no witnesses other than two men who could barely write their names, and the location of the ceremony was marked simply as "Cabin Beyond the Ridge." For the people of the nearby town, it confirmed what they had long whispered about, that the Hollow family's ways were not only isolated but wicked. Jeremiah was said to be the last pure descendant of a line that had long refused to mix with outsiders, believing themselves chosen by divine right to continue their blood untainted. Mary Ellen's name had appeared before in the town's old school records, a quiet, timid girl who often arrived with bruises hidden under her sleeves and eyes that never met anyone's gaze. Then, one day, her name vanished from the attendance list, replaced with the word "withdrawn." No one asked why. People claimed her father had been offered something, land, perhaps, or protection, in exchange for his daughter's hand. Others said he had been threatened by Jeremiah's kin, who had long controlled the woods and the mountain routes, deciding who could live or die within their territory. Whatever the truth, Mary Ellen disappeared into the forest one cold morning and was never seen again by anyone outside the Hollow bloodline. Over the years, pieces of her life emerged like bones in thawing earth. A locket found near the old path, inscribed with her initials. A torn ribbon, aged and faded, discovered in the ruins of an old church that once stood near the ridge. Locals began to tell stories, that she could be heard crying at dusk, her voice tangled with the rustling of leaves, or that her shadow appeared in windows of abandoned cabins whenever the moon was full. The elders said she had been forced to call her captor husband, and that the ceremony had been a mockery of sanctity, a ritual meant to bind her spirit to the Hollow bloodline forever. Some believed that marriage was not the end of her suffering, but the beginning of a curse that would stain the forest and everyone who dared to enter it for generations to come. The Hollow family had lived in those mountains long before the town below even had a name, and by the time Jeremiah Hollow was born, their traditions had already hardened into law. Outsiders called it madness, but to them, it was devotion, a sacred oath passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. They believed their blood was chosen, blessed by something older than the God preached in church pews. They spoke of a spirit that guarded their land, a being of the forest who demanded loyalty through purity of blood. To mix with outsiders, they said, was to invite ruin. So generation after generation, they married within the family, believing they were preserving not only their lineage but the favor of whatever dark force watched over them. As the years passed, the Hollow family began to change, both in body and in mind. Children were born pale and frail, their features slightly twisted, their eyes reflecting a strange glint even in the dim light. Some were said to speak in voices not their own, whispering things they could not have known. Others vanished shortly after birth, taken deep into the woods under the pretense of returning to the earth that gave them life. The elders called it the offering, but to those few who had glimpsed the ceremonies from afar, it looked more like sacrifice. Yet, among themselves, the Hollows believed it was necessary, that through these acts they maintained the balance between their world and the one beyond. Jeremiah grew up being told that he was the chosen one, the one destined to continue the bloodline's perfection. His father, a stern and silent man with eyes like frost, often recited the family's creed, blood unbroken, faith unbroken. Jeremiah learned early that love had no place in their unions, what mattered was continuation, preservation, and obedience. His bride, Mary Ellen, was chosen not for affection but because she was distantly related through a forgotten branch, close enough to be pure, but new enough to refresh what the family called the sacred thread. When she arrived at the cabin, small and trembling, the Hollows celebrated as if heaven itself had sanctioned the union. But those who dared to look upon the ceremony swore that heaven had turned away. The chanting, the strange symbols drawn on the ground in ash, and the haunting melody of voices rising and falling in unison created an atmosphere not of holiness but of something far more sinister. To the Hollows, it was worship. To anyone else, it was a curse disguised as faith, a devotion so deep it had become madness, binding them forever to the darkness that lived in the woods. Not long after the day of the wedding, the girl's family was gone. It happened quietly, without alarm, as though they had been erased rather than taken. Neighbors noticed their cabin standing empty, the fire pit cold, the front door slightly ajar, but no one dared step inside. The only trace left behind was a single boot print in the mud and a trail of what looked like small hand marks leading toward the woods before fading into the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and the townsfolk whispered that Mary Ellen's father had tried to go after her, that he had ventured past the ridge in the dead of night, carrying a lantern and a rifle. Some said they heard the gunshot echo once, then twice, and then silence. When dawn came, only the lantern was found, its glass cracked, the flame still weakly burning beside a fallen tree. From that day forward, no one spoke his name again. Years later, when a new family bought the abandoned land, their dog unearthed something buried beneath the roots of an old oak tree. It was a child's locket, rusted shut and filled with dirt. When cleaned, the initials MEH were barely visible on its back, and inside, beneath the grime, was a faded photograph, Mary Ellen, wearing the same dress from the wedding picture, her eyes dull, her lips pressed into a line that almost looked like fear. The discovery reignited old stories, but no one dared dig further. The sheriff at the time ordered the ground left undisturbed, claiming it was animal remains, though no one had mentioned bones. The Hollow family, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had happened. They were seen less and less around town, their visits confined to rare supply trips that always ended before sunset. Jeremiah himself was rumored to have grown reclusive, keeping to the cabin with his young bride, who was never seen again. Some travelers claimed they heard a woman's voice crying from deep in the woods on foggy nights, pleading in a soft, childlike tone that made the hair on one's neck stand up. Others spoke of finding small, handmade dolls tied to branches, dolls with tiny ropes around their necks, swaying whenever the wind passed through. To the few who still remembered Mary Ellen, it felt like a warning, a way of telling anyone who looked too closely to turn back. The forest had a way of keeping its secrets, and whatever happened to the girl and her family had been swallowed by its roots, leaving only whispers that grew darker with every generation that dared to speak her name aloud. Over the decades, the story of Mary Ellen's cries became part of the land itself, passed down in hushed tones between those who lived closest to the ridge. They said that when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the forest turned to shadow, you could hear her voice drifting through the trees, faint, trembling, and carried on the wind like a secret the woods didn't want you to know. It always began the same way, a low hum, like the beginning of a lullaby, followed by soft sobbing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Hunters claimed that if you stayed too long to listen, the crying would stop suddenly, replaced by the sound of dragging footsteps in the leaves, slow and deliberate, moving closer each second. Most dismissed it as the wind or imagination, but those who had heard it up close swore the sound followed them long after they left the woods, echoing in their dreams until morning. Locals called the phenomenon the bride's call, believing it was the spirit of Mary Ellen trapped between this world and whatever waited beyond. Some said she wandered the forest searching for her family, her innocence bound forever to the soil where she was taken. Others claimed she was kept by Jeremiah's spirit, forced to relive her final night over and over, doomed to cry for a freedom that would never come. Children dared each other to walk past the ridge after dark and whistle 3 times, the supposed way to summon her. Few ever tried, and those who did often returned pale and shaken, unable to speak for days. They said the woods weren't empty, they were watching. Farmers living near the edge of the forest began reporting strange occurrences, the sudden death of livestock, tools found rearranged in perfect circles, and claw-like markings on the sides of barns. One man swore he saw a small figure in a white dress standing at the edge of his property, her face hidden by long, tangled hair. He fired his shotgun into the darkness, but when he checked the next morning, all he found were tiny footprints leading toward the ridge and vanishing into the mist. Every story carried the same ending, that the cries grew louder when the moon was full and the fog hung low, as if the forest itself was remembering her pain. The townspeople eventually learned to stay indoors at night, locking their doors before dusk and lighting candles in their windows, hoping the glow would keep her spirit at bay. Yet even then, on certain nights when the wind was still, the faint sound of a child's weeping would slip through the cracks, reminding everyone that Hollow's Vale never truly slept. The discovery of the journal happened by accident, found not by a historian or a hunter, but by a young boy searching for his missing dog. It was early spring, the air damp with the scent of rain, when he stumbled upon an old hollow tree at the edge of the forest. Inside, wrapped in layers of rotting cloth, was a small leather-bound book, its cover darkened by time and soil. The boy's father brought it home, thinking it might be worth something, but when he opened it, he realized it wasn't a man's writing at all. The shaky, looping letters belonged to a child. The first page bore a name written faintly in smudged pencil, Mary Ellen Hollow. The town had not spoken her name aloud for generations, yet here it was, etched into something that had survived where everything else had vanished. The pages inside were filled with drawings and words that grew more desperate as they went on. At first, the entries were simple, childish sketches of trees, animals, and a house that looked much like the cabin beyond the ridge. But soon the drawings changed. The faces became distorted, eyes drawn too large, mouths stretching wide as though screaming. The handwriting grew uneven, lines slanting down the page, and strange symbols began to appear in the margins, spirals, crosses, and something that looked like a hand with too many fingers. In one entry, written in dark, smudged ink, Mary Ellen described hearing voices in the walls at night, voices that told her to stay quiet or the woods would take her back. She wrote about Jeremiah, referring to him not as her husband but as the man with no shadow, and said that when he prayed, the candles flickered even when there was no wind. Toward the final pages, her writing changed again, this time trembling and uneven, as if written in fear or exhaustion. She spoke of a ritual, the offering of blood to the roots, and of how the family gathered under the moon to chant words she couldn't understand. One entry ended abruptly with the sentence, "He says the forest listens when I cry." The last page contained no words, only a drawing of a door buried underground and a small hand pressed in dried red stains, the print still visible after all those years. The journal was turned over to the sheriff, but within days it disappeared from evidence. Some said the family took it back. Others claimed it burned on its own, reduced to ash before it could be read again. What remained was the certainty that Mary Ellen had tried to tell her story, and that the forest had never stopped listening. Decades after the journal vanished, when most of the townspeople had long accepted that the story of the Hollow family was nothing more than a curse wrapped in folklore, a stranger arrived. He was a drifter, tall and hollow-eyed, with a voice that carried an unsettling calmness. He called himself Caleb and claimed to be a descendant of Jeremiah Hollow. He said he had come home to set things right, though no one had invited him, and no one dared to ask what he meant. He took up residence in the old boarding house at the edge of town, paying for his room in worn bills that smelled faintly of smoke and earth. From the moment he arrived, the air in Hollow's Vale seemed to change. The wind grew restless, the nights colder, and dogs began howling at nothing in particular. Caleb spent most of his days wandering near the ridge, carrying an old lantern and talking to himself in a low murmur that unsettled those who crossed his path. One evening, the bartender claimed he overheard him whispering to the empty air, saying, "She's waiting for me." The bride never left. His words spread quickly, stirring old fears that had never truly died. People started locking their doors earlier, and the sheriff, now an old man with more superstition than patience, warned everyone to stay clear of him. But curiosity got the better of a few, and they followed him one night as he disappeared into the forest with that same flickering lantern. They said he walked straight to the ruins of the old cabin, untouched for generations, and stood there for hours, whispering into the dark. When he finally turned back toward town, his face was streaked with ash, and his eyes looked like he had seen something that didn't belong to this world. Within days, strange things began to happen. Cattle were found dead, their blood drained but their bodies untouched. Doors opened on their own, even when bolted. Children spoke of seeing a woman in a white dress standing by the river, her reflection clear in the water though no one stood beside her. Caleb started telling anyone who would listen that the forest was waking up, that the time of silence was ending, and that the bride still lived beneath the ground. When questioned, he simply smiled and said, "She's not gone. She's waiting to finish the vows." One night, he vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only his lantern burning outside the cabin's door. Some said he had joined her. Others believed he had finally found the Hollow bloodline's final resting place, deep beneath the roots where no light could reach. The discovery of the hidden room came years after Caleb's disappearance, when a group of paranormal researchers ventured into the forest to document the legends surrounding Hollow's Vale. They were skeptics at first, more interested in filming decaying wood and whispering winds than chasing ghosts, but what they found beneath the cabin changed everything. The structure itself was barely standing, its roof sagging and floorboards soft from rot. As they explored by flashlight, one of them noticed a faint draft seeping through a crack in the floor, carrying a smell of damp soil and something metallic. When they pried the boards loose, a narrow opening appeared, just wide enough for a person to slip through. The air below was colder, thicker, almost choking in its stillness, but curiosity pushed them down the wooden ladder into the darkness. The beam of their flashlight revealed walls carved directly into the earth, lined with what looked like soot-stained wood. The space was small, almost suffocating, no more than a few feet wide. But what unsettled them most wasn't the smell or the cold, it was the markings. All along the walls were prints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, small hands pressed into the wood as though burned there. Each print was slightly warped, some with too many fingers, others elongated, all arranged in strange spiraling patterns. The deeper they looked, the more it felt as though the walls were breathing. One of the researchers brushed their hand against a print and immediately recoiled. The surface was warm, pulsing faintly as if alive. In the center of the room stood an old chair, shackled to the floor by rusted chains, and beside it a rotted table covered with candle stubs and remnants of something that looked like dried flowers mixed with bones. Scattered across the floor were remnants of fabric, a torn white dress, the color long faded but still recognizable to anyone who knew the legend. When one of them lifted it, the fabric disintegrated into dust, releasing a faint scent of something sweet and sickly, like old perfume. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the camera lights flickered. Faintly, from somewhere deep in the soil, came the sound of movement, slow and rhythmic, like footsteps dragging through the dirt. They fled the cabin before dawn, leaving their equipment behind. Days later, when local authorities went to investigate, the opening beneath the cabin was gone. The floorboards had resealed themselves as if untouched, leaving no trace of the room or the prints that lined its walls. The only thing that remained was the lingering smell of burned wood and the feeling that something beneath the earth had been disturbed, something that had waited a very long time to be found. The truth revealed itself not through research or science, but through fear. After the discovery of the hidden room, the town began to change in ways that no one could explain. The forest seemed to grow thicker, creeping closer to the edge of town each night, as if the land itself was reclaiming what had been disturbed. Lights were seen flickering among the trees, moving in slow, deliberate patterns that resembled lanterns being carried by unseen hands. Whispers returned to the wind, not stories this time, but voices, overlapping and distorted, calling names that no living person answered to. And then came the dreams. People in town began to wake screaming in the middle of the night, each claiming to have seen the same thing, a young girl in a tattered white dress, standing in the doorway of the cabin, whispering that, he's still waiting. An elderly historian, obsessed with uncovering the final truth, pieced together the fragments left behind, the journal, the locket, the reports of the hidden room. He realized that the girl's spirit was never freed because her wedding had never truly ended. Jeremiah's bloodline had bound her to the ritual, a ceremony meant not for love, but for eternity. Each generation had replayed it, using the youngest of their kin to keep the pact alive. The offerings, the symbols, the strange chanting, all were part of the same unbroken vow, to keep the forest fed and the hollow name eternal. When the family line finally died out, the ritual broke, leaving Mary Ellen trapped between the living and the dead, still waiting for a groom who would never come. The historian's research went missing the night he finished it. His house was found empty, the doors open, his notes scattered across the floor. The last entry in his notebook read only 3 words, "The vows remain." Days later, hikers found what appeared to be a new structure deep in the woods, a freshly built wooden archway adorned with flowers made of bone and moss. Beneath it lay a single footprint, small enough to belong to a child, pressed into the mud beside a pair of larger ones. Locals refused to go near the site, claiming the air around it was colder and that whispers followed anyone who approached. Some say the traveler who vanished first had become part of the story, chosen by the forest to play the final role. Others believe the ceremony never ended and that every soul who enters Hollow's Vale becomes a guest at a wedding that has been repeating itself for over a century, waiting endlessly for someone to finally say goodbye.